So I'm Jill Meyers, UT Austin graduate. And so the summary of my background is, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about this, but I've been flying since I was 17 in high school and joined the Air Force shortly after that. They wouldn't let me fly because I was a girl, long time ago. So I joined the Air Force anyway. I stayed in a little short of 10 years and got my aerospace engineering degree at UT Austin while I was in the military through a really special commissioning program to finish your degree and then become an officer. I got out of the Air Force a while after that and started career-wise as what's functionally called a systems engineer. I'm sure you all know what that is. It was a new thing back in my day. And worked for a lot of the big DoD companies, like I've done Boeing and Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, but I've also worked for small commercial startup companies. Kind of progressed through senior management over the years. Took a year off to do some nonprofit work, and then started my consulting business that I have now formally about a year and a half ago. So right now I have a consulting business called Meyers Aero Consulting, where I consult to various aviation entities. Some are companies, some are nonprofits, some are just projects, and have been doing that here in Albuquerque, where I moved about a year ago. So that's what I'm up to now.
Great. Thank you for that. First of all, we were just wondering if you could tell us a bit about what made you interested in this field in the first place? Did you know what you wanted to do when you were in high school? And kind of what inspired you to get a pilot's license so young?
When I was 13 is when it started. Actually, I'm sorry, I was 12. I found a photo with the date on the back finally. When I was 12, my dad had friends on the Boston coast. They lived in a really small town north of Boston, Massachusetts. And my dad's friend was a pilot and a sailor and an inventor and a really, really cool guy. And we went there every summer for a few days as part of our summer vacation. So when I was 12, we went up there for the third or fourth time in my life. And my dad's friend Josh said to me one day, "Hey, why don't I take you up in my small airplane?" So I went up in a small plane. It's a Cessna 140, what's called a tail dragger. You all know what that is. It was a tail dragger aircraft, tail wheel. And Josh took me up when I was 12, and that was it. So we flew for an hour over the ocean, and I was just like, all right, that's it. I'm enamored with this. It was the most amazing feeling to be flying. So we landed, and at the time I lived in Phoenix, Arizona. So I went back to Phoenix, actually lived in Scottsdale. And we lived a mile from the Scottsdale airport. I used to bike there. So I got on my bike, 12, 13 years old, and I biked to the airport, and I'm like, hey, I want to be a pilot. They're like, you're 12, like really? I spent literally the next couple of years while I was in school, going to the airport all the time after school and on weekends, and asked them if I could wash planes, like anything. Well, you cannot solo legally until you're 16. So I just sort of hung out there for all those years. But what's interesting about my story, and I think a lot about why this all happened, but all through high school, I was the high school version of pre-med. I was for sure going to be a surgeon. There was like no question in my mind I was going to be a doctor. And even though I had this love for flying, I still wanted to be a doctor. So I started taking flying lessons when I turned 16 and ended up getting my pilot's license in December of my senior year. And a lot of people say to me, well, Jill, why didn't you become a pilot? And a lot of the reason is, and it's a lot of what I talk about when I do public speaking these days, is when I was 16, 17 flying, so this was in the late 70s, there were no other women at the airport. There were no other female students. There were no female instructors. There was no one in the tower. And it just never occurred to me that women could be anything professional aviation because I never saw it. And there's a quote from Sally Ride I use a lot. Sally Ride said, "You can't be what you can't see." And I'm a perfect example of that. So if a commercial pilot had walked up to me when I was 17 and said, "Would you like to know how to become a professional pilot?" I would have been all over it. But in my head, I was just pre-med. So I got my pilot's license, graduated high school, did very well, got a full scholarship to Arizona State University, and went to ASU as pre-med. and hated it more than anything because I wasn't passionate about it really. And then ended up thinking, okay, I got to do something with airplanes. But I knew I needed to finish my degree because, oh, by the way, I had quit college after a semester. I don't at all recommend that to anybody. Um, and I found out about the Air Force. So I ended up joining the Air Force when I was 19, and then just fell in love with everything aviation. The first space shuttle went up while I was at UT. So I was like, aha, astronaut, there's a goal. So for a while I was thinking of becoming an astronaut, but my undergrad was not a 4.0. And at the time, I don't know if it's still the criteria, but you couldn't even apply unless you had 4.0s across the board. So immediately eliminated from that process. But getting into the Air Force is what really kind of solidified me, getting finally into the aviation career that I kind of wished I had started on that path when I was in high school, because who knows what would have happened differently. But
yeah, that's amazing, especially the hanging out at the airport. That's really funny.
yeah.
Who were some of your biggest role models during this period of time?
Back then, I honestly didn't have any. I think my first role model, and again, that's, I hate to keep doing this, but I mentor a lot of young women. And one of the reasons I do a lot of mentoring is because I didn't have any role models or mentors as a young person. But once I got to UT, my very first role model was an astronaut way back then, Judith Resnick. And she's sadly now famous because she died in the Challenger crash, the Challenger accident, which happened, by the way, while I was in my orbital mechanics class at UT, is when the Challenger exploded. Never forget that day as long as I live. But Judy Resnick and I had a lot in common. She was young, she's Jewish, which I am. She was an engineer. And I just really always saw her as a role model because we had a lot in common, and I just really was enamored by a young woman who had fought through a lot of challenges being female and Jewish in aerospace, which is not very common, either one of them. So she was really my first role model. And then after that, I think most of my role models ended up to be more on the aviation side than on the aerospace side. One of my biggest role models even today, and I'm really honored that we've become friends in the last, I guess I've known her for 12 years now, but Nicole Malachowski was the first female Air Force Thunderbird pilot who flew in the 2005, 6, 7 seasons. And, again, just really broke through barriers and almost got talked into applying for the Thunderbirds when she was an F-15 pilot flying combat missions in Iraq, and her husband talked her into applying for the Thunderbirds. But she's one of the reasons I love Nicole as a role model is she so didn't make it about her being the first woman. I mean, I remember seeing her at events, and someone in the crowd would say, "What's it like being the first female Thunderbird pilot?" She's like, "Look, I'm just a Thunderbird pilot. Next question." And I always really admired that. And one of the things I like to tell folks is, even if you're the only woman or the first woman, sometimes making it not about that can be useful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually think that's probably both challenging and also rewarding to have seen kind of women like slowly break into these roles as you were growing up and then coming into this field, but also challenging because you didn't have that as you were starting out role model.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just add one more thing. Even when I joined the Air Force, I'd never met anyone in the military. And when I told my family, and I'm originally from Philadelphia, and my favorite line ever was when I told my family I was joining the military, my grandmother's like, "Well, nice Jewish girls from Philly don't go in the military, Jill." It's like, what are you doing? And because again, she had no reference point either. So it was definitely a breaking the mold kind of a time period for me.
Nice girls.
Which I wasn't, but whatever, yeah.
So we wanted to ask you some questions about your career. How did you transition from engineering work into consulting? And can you talk a little bit about whether or not that was more of like an intentional move, or if you kind of just like drifted in that direction and then that's what ended up happening?
That's a great question. Well, career-wise, I did what I'll call hands-on engineering for probably less years than most people because I got into management really early in my career. I just sort of have a natural skill, I guess, at both leadership and management, which are not the same thing. But I still managed, technical engineering programs, obviously. But so my engineering career sort of, the last real engineering job I had in any form, I was again a senior manager, but I worked for Northrop Grumman on the most amazing aircraft built to date, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. And I had an amazing job with Northrop Grumman. I was a senior manager. There were two of us in charge of the build and delivery of all of the communication navigation equipment on the aircraft. So we put 45 pieces of hardware roughly on every single F-35. And it was just like, super rewarding, super exciting. But in early 2017, I had the opportunity to work for a nonprofit. And it's a whole long story. That's like a whole nother session with you guys, but just in a nutshell, there's a young woman named Shasta Ways who in 2017 became the youngest woman to fly solo around the world in a single engine aircraft. She's an Afghan refugee, an amazing woman. She was 29 when she left and 30 when she landed. Well, early in 2017, I got connected with her nonprofit called DreamSoar, and Shasta asked me to kind of be her primary support person to help get her around the world. And the only reason she flew around the world was to do outreach events with young kids. So I also planned all of her outreach events, which ended up to be 32 of them, I think, in like 14 countries. But long story short, in order to help Shasta, I had to be up 24 hours a day because I had to be there for her when she was flying and also on these conference calls all over the world. So I quit my job at Northrop Grumman to help her as an unpaid volunteer for DreamSoar. And I did that for the entire time until she landed, which was in October of 2017. And then I worked for her for a little longer, all unpaid. And then the following summer-ish, I decided that I needed a paycheck again. It's like, this is awesome, Shasta, but like, I got bills to pay. And I needed to go back to work. But when you do something life-changing, like help this young woman fly alone around the world and survive it and inspire 3,000 kids in the process, you kind of can't go back to a regular job. So I had always been told, not always, I had been told by recruiters and placement firms for probably the last, I would say since like 2014, people always said to me, Jill, you ought to be a consultant. And I was always like, ooh, no, yuck, because to be a consultant, you have to go and sell yourself and like get work. And I am not a salesperson. I am not. Like, I'm really bad at that. I go to trade shows like society, I go to the SWE conferences. I've been a member of SWE since 1985. I go to SWE conferences and it's just like, I love hanging out with my friends and going to all the booths. I'm not the kind of person to go around with my business card and go, hi, what can I do for you, So I never wanted to get into consulting because I didn't want the selling myself part of it. But after I was done with DreamSoar, I sort of accidentally met a guy who said he wanted to hire me to help him start a new company. It's like, okay, that's kind of a consulting thing. So this current phase of me doing official consulting with my own company really started formally about 2 years ago when I met this guy. So I've had like 6 clients in the last 2 years. And what's really cool about this consulting business that I've started is I haven't had to ever go out and find work. It's come to me. It's either through my network of friends or, I'll just hear about someone who needs help and say, hey, can I help you? And that's the extent of me selling myself, So that was sort of the transition wasn't direct. I had this nonprofit thing in the middle. And I don't know if I would have gone straight from something like Northrop Grumman to consulting had I not had that interim time frame of really doing something unique and different.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I have a couple more questions about kind of like your consulting career. I was wondering where you see your company going in the next couple of years and what your direction for it is.
So what I'm doing is a bit different than most aviation consulting people or companies, in that I only take on work that is something I'm passionate about. which is usually hard because, you know, in the end, I still have to pay the bills. So I've only so far taken on consulting projects where the end result of what I'm doing or the client I'm working for, where the end result is really, really doing something amazing for the community and helping people. You know, so that whole helping Shasta fly around the world doing outreach sort of got my brain into a mode of saying, if it's not related to really doing something awesome, I don't want to do it, right? So I'd like to continue that trend. And right now, I have really one primary client, which is a guy who's starting a new airline. So when this is all done, I may be CEO of a new airline. By the way, it's kind of insane. But the projects I've done on the side in the last year have all been for nonprofits or really small organizations doing amazing things. And what I would love to do long term, to answer your exact question, Grace, is I would love to somehow consult to only universities and nonprofits and really have it be like only life-changing, helping people like you all do cool things. You know, I'd prefer not to be helping a corporation make money, you know. Sometimes you need some of those jobs, again, because it's all about, we're not wealthy and we have to pay rent and stuff. But it's just, I don't know, I guess I got to a point in my life where giving back was more important than, you know, making money or doing something for myself. So it's that balance. It's really hard when you do have to make money, because not at all wealthy, I'm not. But gearing my whole consulting business toward, you know, consulting for good, I'll call it, is I'd like to keep it in that lane if possible. I don't know if I can, just because of the income requirements, but that's what I would love to do long term.
Yeah, that's really awesome. As an entrepreneur, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced trying to like start a company, get it off the ground, figure out all that kind of stuff?
Well, the consulting company itself wasn't that difficult to create and form, but I'll answer your question more to the project I'm working on, because we are starting a new company. So again, I live in Albuquerque, and to try to encapsulate this in a small story, business people in Albuquerque are super frustrated that they cannot fly nonstop. Like when I came to Austin in November, I can't fly nonstop to Austin from here. No airlines, none. You can't fly to Tucson without changing planes in Phoenix. You can't fly to Colorado Springs without changing planes in Denver. Albuquerque's like a second-tier city, FAA-wise, so we're not a big airline hub. So this entrepreneur that I'm working for, who's, you know, made me into an entrepreneur, he wants to start a commuter air service. We're going to fly a small plane, one of my favorite aircraft on Earth, the Pilatus PC-12. We're going to start with PC-12s. They hold 8 passengers, and we're going to become like I like to describe it as, we're going to try to become a corporate flight department for companies that don't have corporate flight departments. So companies in Albuquerque who need to send people to Tucson weekly are so frustrated with Southwest they can't see straight. So we're going to try to fill those kinds of gaps. So for the last 2 years, I've been really starting this company as an entrepreneur, even though technically I'm a consultant. But some of the challenges that we have are, you have to really understand a couple of things altogether. You have to understand the business side of it, which was honestly always my weakest point. Even when I was at the almost VP level running huge organizations, I only would accept a senior level executive job if I had amazing finance people who could do all the finances for me, because it's the hardest thing for me. So you have to really understand the business and putting the finances of a corporation together, profitable, and things called EBITDA and all these insane things. And then you have to really understand the operations and your customer, which of course I do intimately. And then you have to know how to hire the right people, which is also super hard. So the most challenging thing entrepreneur-wise is that you have to either know all of the pieces or hire the right people who can fill those gaps for you. So for example, finding a finance person was really, really hard. I went through 2 finance people, both highly recommended by very good friends of mine, both who were terrible, which is hard when they're recommended by really good friends. And then I had to finally go on LinkedIn and go, yo, I really need a finance person to help me. I'm starting a new project. They have to understand general aviation. And I got like 5 people responded within an hour. And one of them was a referral from a woman who started her own aviation company. She referred me to the woman who was her CFO, who's now my CFO. But it took a year of struggle to get our finances right. So we lost almost a year of time building a new company because I couldn't get the right finance person. So those kind of things are super, super, super challenging. You gotta know how to pull all the pieces together and do it in a timely fashion if possible, which we're struggling with right now.
I think also though it takes a lot of skill to be able to see those kind of like localized needs, like what you've done, and then make that into something that works as a business. I think that's really cool that you're focused on things that really affect like the local community almost immediately.
Thanks. And you know what else too, Stephanie? This company was formed in a new way, which exactly does what you described. Our new airline company was formed as what's called a public benefit corporation. Like if you start a new company, you can be a C Corp or an S Corp. Well, there's a relatively new one. And what's so cool about public benefit corporation is you are required by law to not only make profit, but you also are required to benefit the community. So what's cool is we use that as a flag to wave when we're looking for investors, which is the phase we're in now. COVID-19's kind of made that hard for us, but we're right now looking for initial capital investors, and for us to say, hey, we will be able to provide you the investor returns and dividends, but if you sign here, you need to understand that our goal is equally to help the community, and it's not all about making money. And you got to understand that if you're going to sign up with us. But the other thing that brings us, though, back on the entrepreneur side, is it's going to bring us only investors that are super passionate about solving the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah.
So, and it's a fine line because it's going to make our pool of potential investors smaller, but we're going to get the right people. So it's super exciting.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. I did not know that classification existed. So
yeah. It's been around for about 2 years, I'm told.
Oh, it's awesome that it's that they're reflecting the needs of the community, especially in a time of coronavirus.
Yeah, for sure.
So, like, shifting gears a little bit, I thought we could talk about how your experience has been in industry as a woman. And so I was wondering if you could tell us maybe how your experience has differed by your peers as a woman in aerospace industry.
Well, it's been interesting, I'll tell you that. The percentages of women in aerospace is, I'm happy to say, double what it was when I was you guys. When I was at UT, we were about 6% of the community, women in aerospace, and now it's 13, 14, which, by the way, is more progress than any other field in aviation of the percent increase. So yay us. I think what made my experiences different than my peers, especially my male peers, is just that, being such a small percentage, you have challenges like, you are sometimes the only woman in the department or in the room or in the building. And just, dealing with those challenges that others didn't have to. There's a ton of ways to get through those kinds of challenges, but, the main difference is just that you have to, as a woman in aerospace, you have to fight the perceptions, whether they're real or not. And that's the biggest problem, I think. And you just, the only way I got through was you just take one day at a time and one issue at a time and just, deal with it in the appropriate manner. But
definitely. You mentioned that, women in aerospace industry have like almost doubled. I was curious how your experience as a woman in STEM has kind of changed throughout the years now that we have doubled in the male to female ratio.
It's it's way different. First of all, just by the sheer numbers, it's rare that you're the only woman these days, although I still have been in recent years. I think it's just that I think the biggest difference is that not only are there more of us that can fight the fight together, but it's become such a topic of training and education and culture where, you know, women in STEM has become a thing. It wasn't a thing before. So it's talked about, you know, HR departments at companies like Boeing and Raytheon and Northrop are making sure that they have a diversity department and teach diversity, whether that's, you know, ethnicity or sexual orientation or gender. So it's become more part of the corporate culture to be cognizant of those challenges and those percentages and deal with them properly, where that wasn't at all the case when I was younger. I mean, when I was younger and I had, you know, a discrimination issue, you really just didn't tell anybody because you had no recourse. I mean, none. And I'll just tell you guys real quick the reason I left the Air Force, because I loved it more than anything. So I went to UT, right? Got my degree, was already enlisted, went on to officers training school. And I went straight from Austin down to San Antonio. I went into officers training school and was the only female out of a squadron of 40 trainees, me and 39 guys. And I walked in thinking, no big deal. First of all, I don't care. First of all, it got me a room to myself. I didn't have to share a room. It was awesome. And I was prior service, so I had a leg up on everybody anyway. There were 3 of us out of the 40 that were prior military. So I go through this 12-week, rigorous, ridiculously hard program. And 2 weeks before graduation, the commander pulled me in his office and said they were throwing me out. And I said, why is that? And I had failed a run test. I actually ripped all the muscles off my hip bone and failed the 1.5 mile run test. We have to have 3 failures to get kicked out of OTS. So I looked at this colonel and I said, well, you know, I have to have 3 failures. I don't. He's like, oh, yeah, you do. Wink, wink. And they falsified my records and threw me out of OTS, which ended up ending my Air Force career. They put me back enlisted and I could have stayed, but I had just gotten my amazing aerospace engineering degree at UT Austin that I would never use. So it ended up getting me out of the military. So what happened? There was nothing I could do about it, you know. I got to my next assignment, by the way, in Colorado Springs, and a colonel that I had worked for at my prior assignment in Europe was also in Colorado, and he called me in his office. We had a chat. He found out that they didn't really handle it well. There was a huge legal investigation, and at the end of it, the base judge advocate general, the JAG, called me in and said, okay, we looked into what you said happened. I said, yeah. And they said, well, you're right. I said, I know. And they said, well, we'd like to offer you to go back to OTS. I'm like, okay, under what conditions? So they said, well, first of all, you have to start over day 1. I was like, yes, Stephanie, that's exactly what I did. And I said, and I looked at him and I said, and let me guess, the same guy who threw me out is still in charge. They went, yup. And I looked him in the eye and I'm like, do I look stupid? Like, what? No. So I knew in my heart that they threw me out so there wouldn't be one skirt at the parade at graduation. There was nothing I could do about it. Had that happened today, whole different world. There's a process, you know, probably, by the way, it wouldn't happen today. Yeah. But long answer to your question, Priyal, but there's structures in place now to handle discrimination complaints there wasn't when I was younger. And it just makes, I think, being a woman in STEM, woman in aerospace, woman in the military, a whole lot easier than it was when I was younger. And I'm really grateful for those changes.
That's crazy.
So shocking.
Can I just ask, I'm curious, for the run test, was it the same, were you held to the standard of the same time as all the men, or was it, I mean, is that
You're gonna love this answer. You ready? So when you do the run test in the military, there's, at least when I was back then, there were 4 different times. There's male and female, and there's under 30, over 30. But here's the best part. So there's an Air Force regulation that tells you, as I was, if you're a female under 30, your time is whatever to run 1.5 miles. Well, at officers training school, they decided officers need to run faster than enlisted people. Stupidest thing on earth. So OTS in San Antonio had even faster numbers. So what's really crappy about what happened to me is, even though I fell, ripped all the muscles off my hip bone, which caused me problems for 10 years, I was faster than Air Force regulation time. but 3 seconds slower than officer trainee time, and they wouldn't waive it. Welcome to the military.
I didn't expect to be this angry on this Zoom call. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's all better now.
Well, moving from that, we are trying to create a much more inclusive environment at TREL, and also encourage more women to join and apply and be part of this, and also strive for leadership roles. And we were wondering if you had any advice to share about kind of creating an optimally inclusive environment, especially at a place that's sort of as malleable as a university lab.
I think it's going to sound really corny, but just be gender agnostic. I mean, don't care what people's gender is. I know it's so easy to say and so hard for some people to do, but I think just making it really clear that there's no biases at all based on any of the, again, the categories that you can discriminate someone for. Treating everyone equally, and it just sounds so easy, and I don't know why it's so hard for people still, but I think that part of what you have to do though, and this is I think where it gets hard for any environment, especially one like you're describing, is if there is bad behavior, it has to be dealt with. And that's the hardest part. You know, there has to be ground rules set that this is acceptable behavior, you know, no discrimination, everyone's on par, you treat people in a university lab environment based on their skills and how nice they are. And nothing else should really matter. But I think when people cross the line, they have to be held accountable. And that's always the hard part. That's always the hard part. But I think it's really important because a lot of the challenges in building, I think building an inclusive environment isn't the hard part, it's maintaining it. I think in maintaining it, there has to be some ground rules that are clear, and people in charge have to have the strength to hold those accountable that don't follow those ground rules. Mm-hmm. Whatever you all decide those, you know, what happens to someone if they cross that line, you have to decide that. But, you know, sometimes it's just as simple as pointing it out to people. You know, some people honestly just genuinely are not aware of how they come across. And sometimes just pointing out to someone, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so, like, I didn't mean to say that, I'm so sorry. And it's over, you know? So there's obviously levels of bad behavior and what you do about it. But I think really holding people to those ground rules, whatever they are, has got to be really key. And just making it a warm and welcoming environment for everybody.
Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So I feel like if you're in the position of taking applications for a position, right? And let's say we go gender agnostic and, you know, you don't see, you just judge people on their experience and whatever. I find it difficult to account for, let's say, if you're going off of experience and how much, you know, prior work that person may have done or organizations they may have been in or leadership positions, for example. It's difficult to control for other organizations who may have done less to account for their own biases in these situations. And then, you know, maybe saying, oh, well, this person has 3 leadership positions and this person doesn't, so we should take, you know, this person. And the difference there is male and female, maybe because the woman wasn't able to get those leadership positions at other places, you know, so it becomes a bad kind of cycle.
Right.
What are your opinions on that, and maybe accounting for that?
Well, I think in that case, you really can't be gender agnostic, right? It has to be part of the equation, but I think you have to, I mean, it's all about, when you're reviewing applications for anything, it's got to be all about that person's ability to succeed for you and for themselves. So if you know that someone, if you're reading an application and you sense that someone was held back for whatever reason, I would just add that to the equation and just have that be part of, you know, what you're balancing out when you're looking between person A and person B. But, you know, the whole challenge with reviewing applications or resumes of any kind is there's so much more to the story than what you're looking at, right? So I think if you're looking at someone's app as you just described, and you're like, well, maybe this person was held back because of their gender, I would have that conversation with them and just, make sure you're right on that assumption, first of all.
Mhm.
But that would have to fold into the equation, because what you really want to look for when you're bringing anyone onto a team is their ability to succeed and their ability to integrate with the others. The whole play nicely thing, which sometimes is more important, by the way, because you can't teach that, I don't think.
Yeah.
The rest you can teach. But so, yeah, in that case, it has to be part of your decision, but in the right way. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I wouldn't just assume, this person was held back because she was a woman, therefore I would have that specific conversation and ask those questions and see what's behind that and see if that really was the case, and then get the sense of whether that aptitude really is underneath,
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'll be really helpful to incorporate into our recruiting cycles in the future, just like talks about implicit bias that people may have reading applications.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question kind of based on my experience, like working as an engineer. So like when you're just starting out, how do you balance asserting your like intelligence and relative authority as a woman relative to men, while still like recognizing like, hey, I'm just starting out, I may not know as much as these people, but I don't want to be bulldozed just because I'm a woman.
Yeah, it's a hard balance, but the advice I always give people is that you have to balance. It's a hard balance. You have to balance making sure that people are aware of what you bring to the table, which is going to be a combination of intelligence, as you mentioned, and again, also just your ability to manage people and deal with people. But you do have to acknowledge that you're new and that you're not the smartest person in the room. And I'll give you guys maybe a story as an example. I love telling this story. So my very first job as a manager ever of people was at Raytheon. It was 2001. And I was hired by Raytheon outside of Washington, D.C. And I was put into a position where it was a pure system engineering organization. It was one of the parts of Raytheon that did really super highly classified, super complicated hard stuff. And they asked me to run this system engineering organization. And it was a range of people. It was like this mishmash of people. When I first looked at the list of my employees, I had, I think, 20 employees to start, which is really way too many, by the way, for a new manager. And I looked at these 20 people and I went to my boss and I'm like, how did you decide who gets in this group? And she's like, oh, anyone who doesn't fit in any other box, we just throw them in your group. I'm like, okay, great. So I had literally people ranging from brand new college graduates, 22, 24 years old, all the way up to two people that were the most senior engineers in the building. And there were three of them and their name all started with B, so we called them the three Bs. And I had two of the Bs in my organization. So I had this guy working for me who'd been with Raytheon like 40 years. But I knew coming in, not only was I a new manager, but the technology I was in charge of was new to me. It was, again, really complex classified stuff, which I can't tell you about. So, but here's what happened. The very first day, my very first week of work, and I do this every time I take a new job, before I have a big old staff meeting, I meet with every person individually first. So Bob comes into my office. I am not making this up. Bob walks in my office. He shuts the door. He sits down. He looks at me. He says, I just want to tell you that you will fail. And I don't want you to ever, ever talk to me, ever. And he got up and he walked out. I was like, great. So, and I'm getting to answer your question if you're wondering. So the way that I had to win Bob over, and it took a year, but I did it, is I finally figured out that I had to make sure he knew that I wasn't as smart as him and that I had something to learn. So one time there was a really hard technical problem in my group that the people assigned to it couldn't solve. So I go walking into Bob's office, who had ignored me for like 11 months, no-showed every staff meeting, wouldn't even get a vacation approval. He would just like go somewhere. And I walked into Bob's office and I said, hey, wonder if you have a minute, I really need your help with something. And he's like, really? You need my help? And it took me, and it wasn't as if I didn't really understand what I needed. Some of it was pretend, some of it wasn't, but I had to really go in and say, look, I'm well aware that I'm not smart about this and you are. And that was not easy for me to do, by the way. And that's I'm using that as an example of the balance. Sometimes you have to make sure people know that you don't think you're the smartest person in the room, even if you do, by the way. But you have to balance that being assertive with not coming across cocky. And I think it's easier for women to do that, by the way, than men, from working for so many people in my life. But it is a balance. And then there's the whole people viewing you as a young woman in a leadership role. Right away, they're like, oh, really? So I always tell people that all you can do is be your best every day that you wake up. And a lot of it is trying not to be more than you are. And that's sort of, Grace, finding that line that you first asked me about. You have to know where your comfort level is, whether it's your level of intelligence, your management experience, and you have to really be okay knowing when to say, I have no idea what to do about this. I have no idea how to answer your question, but let me go find out. And that's, I think, the key is knowing when you don't know something and being okay saying, I have no idea, but
Yeah.
still giving them the confidence that you'll help them find the answer.
Yeah. No, that's very powerful, as a leadership technique, and both as working on a team and managing a team. Do you have any advice for early, people starting early in their career or students on how to navigate these complex social situations and sort of be able to read them better as we go forward?
My number one answer is find a mentor. Find a mentor, like yesterday, find a mentor. I am huge on mentoring, as I mentioned earlier, partly because I never had any when I was younger, and I really wish I had. And I've seen the success of the women I've been mentoring in the last, particularly 4 or 5 years, and it makes me cry when I talk about these amazing women. But to me, when you're navigating these kind of waters for the first time as a young person of either sex or anything, having someone who's been through it before to help you is so much more important than I can possibly stress. And one of the things I like to recommend to people, it's more appropriate when you're in the workplace than when you're a student, but when you get into the workplace, you've got to find a mentor really quickly. And what I always recommend to people, and some companies with formal mentoring programs actually require this, is they always say that your mentor should be 2 levels above you, not 1. So 2 management levels above you and not in your chain of command, basically. So not your boss's boss. And what I always tell people when they're looking for a mentor is try to pick someone, and obviously if you're a woman, you're going to most likely pick a woman first, but pick someone who either you just admire the heck out of, or someone who's in a job that you might see yourself aspiring to someday. So as an example, I was at a company once where I was at Boeing actually, and I could talk about Boeing all day. My least favorite company on earth, by the way. Please don't go work for them, please. If anyone wants to go to Boeing, call me privately. I'll tell you why not to. The most unethical company on this planet. So I was at Boeing, and I was in a meeting one day where I was briefing the president of our part of Boeing on something, and who later became CEO of the company. But we were in a room with his entire VP staff, and one of them was a woman who I'd never met before. And I literally watched her in this meeting, and I was like, wow, she's fantastic. And I beelined over to her after, and I'm like, hi, I'm Jill Meyers. Is there any chance that you could take me on as a mentor? And she's like, let's talk. And she was 3 levels above me, and someone I never thought would say yes. And she was just the most, warm-hearted person ever. And she helped me. I mean, we didn't have a formal mentoring relationship. I mean, if I needed help, I would go to her. It was fairly impromptu, but she helped me so much because she'd been there, done that. And, you know, she was probably only 4 or 5 years older than me, but had just exploded through her career. So I think it's really important to find the most important thing, to find a mentor who has walked down the path that you're about to walk down and can really help you, because it's really hard navigating early career no matter who you are. You know, there's so many challenges that you're going to have that you did not see coming. And there's nothing more important than having someone you can go to confidentially and say, how on earth did you get through this thing that's in front of me? It's unbelievably helpful.
That's really good advice. And I feel also that that's really helpful in terms of, like, you know, you have someone to advocate for you in these situations. And also, you know, I've always felt that in spaces where there's very few women anyway, sometimes there's kind of an air of competition, especially if you're close in age. And I think it's nice to kind of, you know, do the opposite of that and develop a mentor-mentee relationship. But I just appreciate what you're saying, is my point.
Yeah, and again, your mentors can be men. Trust me, I've had some amazing male managers and amazing male leaders. But it's likely in the aviation aerospace world that some challenges you might face might be because you're a woman. So it really does help to have a woman that's walked it before that you can go to. So for sure, but don't exclusively look for women though.
Sure.
So, yeah.
A quick follow-up to this, because someone asked in the chat, what do you think is the best approach if you see someone at a company that you think would be a great mentor? What's the best way to approach that conversation or start that conversation?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not always easy. I think, you know, I can only answer it the way I've done it, is the way I did it, like with this one individual, is, you know, I just really approached her and I said, you know, I've seen you in a couple meetings and I really like your style. And, you know, I just basically said, would you at all be interested in, you know, building a mentor relationship and just helping me out kind of here and there? And she's like, absolutely. I think if you approach them with it as a, you know, first of all, compliment them somehow. Secondly, you know, make sure that you are flexible in what kind of mentoring relationship you want. And, you know, and it used to be, when I was in the workplace and would try to push mentoring in my companies, a lot of people who I thought would be amazing mentors to others, the response was always, I don't have time. I don't have time to meet with you weekly. It's like, well, it doesn't have to be that, you know. You know, mentoring can be one cup of coffee. You can get a lot out of one meeting with someone, and, you know, that mentor-mentee relationship can be as intense or as casual as the two of you agree that it works for you. So I think that's the other trick, is make sure when you first approach someone, you don't have these ridiculously high expectations of, let's meet every Thursday for lunch at the same place and spend an hour talking, because they're not going to have that kind of time. So if you don't put any hard requirements on it for time commitment, you'll be much better off in your approach to them.
Thank you. I think that's an awesome way to go about doing it. Again, shifting gears once more, this is more general life questions and advice. One of our questions were, what kind of technological development in the aerospace field was the most exciting for you, and maybe some reasons why? So
there's two things going on right now. They've been for a while, but there's two things technologically that excite the heck out of me. And I talked about this when I was there with you guys last November. One is electric powered aircraft, because the most challenging part of developing future aircraft with better performance is the weight of the fuel. It's impossibly heavy. Electric power is super challenging, though. It's like super challenging, as everyone's working on. NASA's been working on an electric aircraft, testing it for years and years now. There's a lot of, I think I just read an article, there's like 25 companies building electric aircraft now. There's a ton. But electric powered aircraft, I think, are going to be massively important, especially, you see what's happening this week with fuel prices, with the coronavirus. It's at, they're negative numbers now, which has never happened in the history of the world. And I don't even know what it means for a barrel to be negative $42. It is $38, whatever it landed at the other day. But we have to not be fuel dependent, first of all, just economically. And second of all, electric power is just going to be amazingly good for the environment and good for performance of aircraft. And then the second is supersonic. There's my favorite company doing supersonic, and I'm very lucky to know the founder and the CEO. It's a company in Denver called Boom Supersonic. Yeah. And Blake Scholl's the founder. He's an awesome guy. I've hung out with him a couple times. Spent a whole day there 2 summers ago. Boom is building the next Concorde, basically, and it's going to be the commercial airline version. There's another company, I forget who, doing a small business aviation version. But Boom's aircraft is going to be 50 passengers, whereas the Concorde was 100, so it's half the size. But the way that it will change air travel is massive, in terms of that you could literally, I said earlier with this little airline we're starting, is great that I'm trying to get people from Albuquerque to Colorado Springs and back in one day. Well, Blake's trying to get people from Denver to London and back in one day. But it's really going to change people's lifestyle and being able to travel, X times the speed of airliners today. And it's just a super, super fun thing. One thing I love about what Boom is doing is they're working very hard. And I just saw a press release the other day that they're making headway. They're working really hard to quiet the sound of the supersonic boom, because so when the Concorde flew, long before y'all were born, when the Concorde flew, it was only allowed to fly over the ocean. It could not fly over land because the FAA never allowed it because it was too flippin' loud. So, Blake's vision doesn't really work unless he can fly over land. They have 500 routes already scoped out for the Boom aircraft. So getting that boom quieter, and I know NASA Armstrong, an amazing place, by the way. If anyone's looking for internships or anything or jobs, NASA Armstrong, go find them. They're out at Edwards Air Force Base in California. NASA Armstrong tests every single aircraft known to man before it does anything. I know their chief engineer, who happens to be one of the only women chief engineers at NASA, CJ Bixby. She's amazing. But they are working really hard on behalf of NASA and the community to get that boom quiet. So I think electric and supersonic are the 2 technological changes that are going to change everything for the industry, for space and for aviation and for space.
That is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fun stuff.
I had a follow-up question to that. How do you feel about the direction that both private and government entities are moving right now? And kind of going off of that, do you agree that our largest goals, government and private, should center on the kind of moon to Mars travel? Or do you think we should focus more on science robotic exploration?
Yeah, I know it's not popular, but I am so not in favor of going back to the moon. I'm seriously. And I get that it may be the stepping stone to Mars, and I get that we probably need to look at extra planetary stuff, but we have so many, it's Earth Day. Hello, it's Earth Day. We have so many problems on this planet that we could use airspace technology for, including, by the way, what's going on the space station. So, I'm sure you guys all know, experimentation on the space station is so enormously helpful for us here on Earth. And I've been swayed a little bit, and I'm not at all saying that she agrees with me, and please don't quote me on it, but someone else I'm just pinching myself still today that I'm friends with is retired astronaut Nicole Stott. And one of Nicole Stott's favorite sayings is that we are all Earthlings on this satellite called Earth. And she's really fascinating, and she's been doing a lot of podcast interviews from her home in Florida since COVID hit. And she did an amazing podcast interview about a week ago. And she's like, I always say, we're Earthlings on this space station called Earth, but now we need to be the crew, and we need to be in charge, and we need to be driving what we're doing as Earthlings on this space station satellite called Earth. And I am much more in favor of spending NASA's research money and everyone else's research money on making Earth a better place. And yes, I saw, what was the movie when we had to get off of Earth? Interstellar. I saw it. I loved it. I've seen it 7 times. I own it. But I would rather see us spend, and maybe not 100% one or the other, but I wish we would spend less money on Moon and Mars and more of our genius brains, like all of you on this call, on making Earth a little more habitable for the future.
I super agree with that. Particularly the Mars stuff, especially since we could do, rovers, and we have been doing rovers, and that's been perfectly fine. But I mean, the PR person in me though is like, yeah, Mars, but only for the photos.
And I just have to give you guys a little hilarious tidbit, and I think it's it's just, I don't know why I just thought of it, but I did. So I don't know if you all know the really famous John F. Kennedy speech when he said, we're going to go to the moon, because we can, blah, blah, blah. I was being born while he was giving that speech.
Oh my God.
So I was like destined to do what I'm doing thanks to John F. Kennedy. And I'm all for space exploration, but not the way that we're funding it today.
And again, a follow-up to that, in terms of the private industry, outside of kind of the space station and what's happening up there, where do you think that private aerospace should be focusing its concerns and its funding?
That's a good question. I think maybe if it were me and I was queen for a day, a second space station with more modern stuff. So you're gonna laugh. So I graduated from UT in 1987, that's how old I am. And when I was in my senior year, we did a senior project where we helped NASA gave us real money, and we helped design the habitat modules that are on the space station now. It was in 1987. And if you see video of what's on that thing, it's like it's like watching the movie Alien. It's like ancient looking stuff. I would do a second space station because, again, there's so much experimentation that can be done at 0G, and I think we should be doing that. The space station today, the design of it is so limiting. It is so limiting, not just the size of it, but the lack of modernization. I mean, they can only upgrade it so much, and they do. But if you were to start over and get geniuses to design a new space station today, I think we could get so much bang for the buck out of that, and I don't see anybody talking about it.
Huh. That's really interesting. Yeah, I feel like during my time at NASA, a lot of the people that interacted with us on social media, externally, whatever, had a lot of kind of a lack of just general knowledge of like what was even happening up there, and if the space station was doing anything at all. So I kind of feel like public opinion is on the negative on that front, which is really unfortunate because you make a good point.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, as I'm sure you all know, in the end of May, we're finally going to hopefully launch astronauts from the US again for the first time since the shuttle program. I think more money into those programs too, so we can completely get out of being reliant on the Russians to send our astronauts into space. Yeah. And I know there's a ton of programs, and there's a lot of different entities trying to do that. But again, I would throw more funding and energy that way.
That shifting gears yet again, kind of like career path kind of questions. In terms of grad school, would you recommend going to grad school straight out of undergrad or working first before you go and pursue a higher degree?
I am a huge fan of going direct, which I wish I had done. Just because I mean, so many people successfully do grad school later, but it's hard. You know, I got into the workforce and started, and this is super embarrassing, but I started my master's degree in 1991 and have never finished all these years later, because I happened to get into jobs that were a lot of travel. And even though I was doing online learning, which I, by the way, really, really hate and I'm bad at, but it was my only choice because I traveled a lot, I still couldn't get classes finished. So, and I just think that if you're going to go for your master's and or your PhD, that you need to be really super focused on it. And I just personally, for me, I could never do it while I was working. And a lot of people say, well, I'm going to go work for a few years and then I'll leave and take a sabbatical and do grad school. It just, for some people that works out, but I think for a lot, it's challenging. So I wish I had gone straight through. And the other thing that's different today, which was not the case when I was a kid, is you can now go, and you all probably know this, but you can go from your master's degree straight into a PhD program, which you never used to be able to do. One of the young women I'm mentoring just started at Georgia Tech, and she graduated from Embry-Riddle with her aerospace engineering degree and got immediately accepted into actually 5 schools, I think, but into Georgia Tech's PhD program in aerospace. So there's a master's that you get, in the middle somewhere, but you can go straight to PhD now, which you could know. I mean, it's a 5-year program, but that wasn't even offered when I was younger. So I'm a big fan of going straight through because, first of all, you're in that learning education mindset. Second of all, I think it will make you, for some jobs, more appealing to hiring managers if you do have the advanced degree. But it really also depends on your career path. So I'm not saying that that's true for everybody. It really depends on what kind of job you want to do when you get out of school. You may want to go into a career where a graduate degree isn't as important long-term, where you may just try to do it on the side later. So the answer kind of would also depend on what your path is. But my default answer is I would recommend looking into going straight through and just get it over with.
Yeah. I've always struggled with thinking about grad school, knowing what you want to go to grad school for without working first. Do you have any advice about that? I know there's internships and you can learn kind of what you do like, what you don't like from those, but a lot of people only have 1 summer of internship under their belt before they have to make this decision. Do you have any advice about that?
Yeah, I would try to find a graduate program that you can also integrate co-oping or internship with the grad program. So that your grad program is not straight education schoolwork either. That way you get that balance while you're still in school. Because a lot of grad programs have the work side of it. So I would look for the ones that are, that allow you to go off and work at real companies at the same time, which a lot of them do.
Yeah, kind of an additional follow-up to that. Do you ever recommend people pursuing even further education and actually getting their PhD?
Well, PhD straight away is hard. This young woman I'm mentoring wanted to get her PhD because she is going to be an astronaut no matter what it takes. And she knows that will help her. But I've reminded her, kind of to your point, Grace, is that I've reminded her a couple times because she wants to go straight through school and apply. I'm like, you can't. You need 3 years of experience, even if you have a PhD. So you got to get the work side in as well. I would recommend, so my opinion on PhDs is they're really only, I'm going to put my hiring manager hat on. My hiring manager hat is all the organizations I managed, I never ever had a requirement ever for anybody with a PhD ever. And if they had one, it was well, that's nice, good for you. Because that wasn't the kind of organizations I manage. So again, it depends on what you want to do. I think if someone really wants to get a PhD, they really have to look at why they want that PhD and how valuable it's going to be in your career going forward, because it's super uber hard to get a PhD. Master's degree gets you into so many more jobs than a bachelor's does, but the percentage of jobs that require that PhD is super, super small percent. So I think it really depends on what your career goals are and how much a PhD will help you get there. If you want to get a PhD just to get that learning in, that's fantastic. But I would do that on the side. I would not do that in lieu of work, if that makes sense.
Also, on the same line of thought, someone asked if you have any recommendations for people that don't maybe have engineering backgrounds but are still interested in getting into the aerospace industry.
Oh, there's so much. You can be anything and be in aerospace. You know, as I mentioned earlier, really good finance people in aerospace are the make or break of the organizations. You know, I mean, when I managed so the largest organization I ever managed, it was almost like a part of the company. I was a director, and you know, I would have failed miserably had I not had not only really good engineers, but because we were building airplanes, people who manage supply chain, purchasing, contracts, absolutely make or break. So, you know, whether you have a engineering technical background or degree, whether you're business finance, they're all desperately needed to be, you know, as long as you had a passion for the industry, that gets you into aerospace, you know, no matter what. You know, we needed really good lawyers. I mean, it's almost like a little world in itself, you know. So every single career field, almost every, is needed. But the people that carried me through at my senior executive levels were finance, contracts, and supply chain. Without those three functions, we would have completely failed. And of course, human resources to get the right resumes in front of me to do those reviews, Stephanie, right, of all those applicants.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's it for all of our questions, unless any of you guys have any additional follow-up.
That was great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me. It was super fun.
It was really awesome to hear you talk on all that stuff.
But yeah, it was really awesome to talk to you about this and get your thoughts on a lot of these topics.
Anytime.
Hopefully we can plan and try and schedule something like this again in the future.
Yeah.
So you guys need to keep me posted on your progress. I mean, I'm going to be watching your website and your social media now, but definitely keep me posted. And if I can do anything else for you, let me know.
Will do.
We have one more question. This person says, you mentioned that you had a knack for management. What made you think that about yourself?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Just the way that people responded to me when I got into management, you know, so not to trash Boeing again, but when I was at Boeing early in my career, when I left the military, most of the managers in my part of Boeing were people I did not respect at all. So I never wanted to be a manager ever. And then when Raytheon offered me a management position and I wanted to move back east, so we moved up to DC, I didn't have any training at all because they didn't do it. It's like, oh, you're managing 20 impossibly hard people now, go. But the response I got was really positive. So I say that I have a knack for management because once I got into it, I ended up to be really good at it. And the other thing that I want to make sure to say is one of the things I think that made me a really good manager, and you may not think this is on the list of criteria, but you have to be a really compassionate person, in my opinion, to be a good manager of people. Because if you don't truly care about what happens to them and they're just, you know, a person on your org chart, you're not going to be a good manager. And again, it's just in my personality. I didn't know that going in. I didn't try. But I had so much response from people saying to me, you know, you really care about us. I'm like, well, yeah. And one of the examples I can give you is I was hired by a company once who brought me into a management position of a group of people who had 3 really horribly bad managers before me. And they were very down on managers. And they're like, you know, oh, great, now who, you know? And I walk in from nowhere and was able to really turn this organization around. But within about a month of my being there, we had to start laying off people. We were owned by a foreign entity, and it was just a foreign entity problem. But and I was just devastated. I'm like, I just got here and I gotta like lay people off. But the way that I handled it, just as an example of compassion, is every time we had a leadership staff meeting and we learned what was going on, I would call my group into a meeting and I would share it with them. And after like the second time, they're looking at me going, you're actually telling us what's going on? Like, no one ever does that here. I'm like, what do you mean no one ever does that here? So that's what I mean when it's like, it comes naturally to me to communicate with people and be honest. A lot of managers don't do that. So I say that just because things that are natural in my personality happen to do me well, and people always told me I was the best manager they ever had. And it's only because I cared and I listened and helped them when they needed it. And it's just not that hard, but a lot of people don't see it that way. So I hope that answers your question.
Definitely. I think we can conclude, I guess, the interview portion unless anyone has any other additional last minute questions. But thank you, Jill. We really appreciate you coming out. If you're open to it, we'd love to follow up with you. TREL is actually attempting to do kind of an industry advisory board in the near future, where people in industry can come out and offer their feedback and come and help out and give talks like this. So we'd love to follow up with you. Yeah, we'd love to follow up with you maybe in the future about that.
Please do. I would love that. I would love that. Thank you. I'm very honored. Thank you. That'd be great.
Yeah, we'd appreciate it very much.
Yeah, we would love your input for sure.
Yeah, hopefully next time you're in Austin, we can show you some rocket parts and we'll have them all made.
Well, I'm supposed to be there the first week of October, I think. There's something going on. I think I'm on a list for it. We'll see what happens with the world, but that would be the only thing on the books. But yeah, I mean, if there's something earlier than that, definitely. But yeah, look forward to seeing you guys in person again. I know I definitely saw some of you in November, so.
That sounds
Right.
awesome.
Thank you again. I really appreciate you guys asking me. This was very fun. So
thank you for us as well.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.